Okay, so it is interesting talking to Matt. He was talking about the clothes that Neil usually wears. I mean, coming up and doing these types of presentations is always, an interesting experience. And last night we were at dinner, and I was standing with Marty and with Matt, and I came in, and the first thing they said to me is, "Are you sure Neil's really not here?" I said, "No, Neil's not here." And they said, "Can't you do you think you can present like Neil?" I said, "No, I'm pretty sure I can't present like Neil. He's kind of a one of a kind." And and then I think somebody went out last night trying to buy me a new suit, so at least I might look like Neil a little bit. But for those of you who've met him, I hope you can at least appreciate what we'll do here today. So it's interesting. I am my title's VP of the Global Data Center Offer. One part of that job, which is the primary part of my job, is trying to look forward 3 to 5 years time frame and try and steer the Schneider portfolio to be responsive to these disruptive trends that we all see going on. But one of my favorite parts of my job is I work in what we call our Data Center Science Center, which publishes all of our white papers. And certainly Neil's been a major contributor to that, but there's a team of people that we fund as a company, and this is all they do, is they go off and they look at new trends and do research, and then we make almost all of that research freely available on our website, and we create TradeOff tools. And that's what's led to this presentation today, is one of those research efforts we did. And it's a little bit of an unusual one, as Matt mentioned, for us to do, because cloud, whether someone goes to a Colo or they build the enterprise data center themselves, either way, our business is, we're impacted certainly, but either way, we're still supplying the power and cooling equipment that goes into those data centers. So what started happening is customers started coming to us and asking for guidance on how we do it, because we were viewed somewhat like a neutral third party. And so we started researching this and trying to give people some guidance and trying to, look at it. So half this presentation is talking about this white paper that we published and what our findings were and some of the things that we learned. And then the second half is trying to talk a little bit about some other thoughts that came out of that exercise that I wanted to share with you. So I really appreciate it. I just want to thank Uptime and 451. This has just been, it's just a great event. And to me, this is just a fascinating topic. So I'm really pleased to be able to share it with you guys. So one of the things that we found is when customers are going in and trying to evaluate, do they go to a Colo or should they keep their data centers in-house, or what should they do in this situation? There was really 3 critical pieces that all the conversations went to. Okay? And most of the time the customers didn't know that this is where the conversations were going. But when we went back, we went out and I talked to a number of different customers about this topic, and we were able to boil it down, is that at the end of the day, the decisions criteria always came around, what's the cost trade-off? Okay? Cash flow was an interesting one too that came up. That cost and cash flow are not the same, and what we started learning was a lot of people don't fully understand the difference between those two. I think they do intellectually. I'm not saying it's something they can't understand, but when you look at the evaluation and how you're evaluating it, sometimes the weighting of cash was more important than cost, and that could be very confusing to people who are traditionally cost-oriented. And then the third one, which is interesting, is what we call strategic factors, and I'm going to go through those in some level of detail, but these are decisions that have nothing to do with the money. Okay? Absolutely nothing to do with the money. That might be one of the key things that's really driving the company's decision on whether they go to Colo or whether they build inside. And the thing that we almost always came through, every company going through this, was there was not a clear process to evaluate these options. And that's really where the opportunity is. Whether you're on the enterprise side or whether you're a Colo side today, how do you get better clarity on what's happening through that decision-making process? And that's a big part of what we were trying to emphasize through the paper. So some of the challenges for the customers and some of the things that we started trying to do is, first of all, is we saw the need for a very simple financial model to allow people to evaluate options. Okay. The simple model, this is meant, I just want to be clear, this is meant as an evaluation tool. That's what we're trying to get to, is get to some very simple models, allow you to evaluate it so that you can start analyzing which option might make more sense. It is not the same as doing a detailed budget plan. Okay? That's a different set of activities that need to happen. But the point that on this is, and we've done a lot of these types of simple models. I mean, if, again, you can go and see our different trade-off tools that we've put together. So we've got a fair amount of experience, I think, at doing these. Most of the time what you learn is that the simple models actually get you really close. All right, and I remember the reason I bring this up is I've sat in a few of these types of events, and I remember very clearly one person got up, and the guy was a consultant. So as a consultant, he's obviously selling his value. But part of what he was saying is, hey, this decision about whether you're going into a colo or whether you're going to build is incredibly complex. You don't understand. There's like 250 variables that you need to consider, and you have to go through all of these. And obviously, his point was, well, that's why you need to hire me in order to help you through this process. Right? We actually believe the opposite. Most of the time, the decisions come down to some very simple variables that you need to focus on. And really, the point is to focus on the 4 or 5 ones that really influence what's happening, and don't worry about the rest to at least get you through this first process. The second big thing that we noticed is getting a common financial metric to easily compare options. So we found a lot of customers have a very difficult time trying to understand, how do I compare my costs associated with going into a colo versus building my own, and do I use dollars per square foot, and this guy's giving it to me in dollars per rack per month. I got another colo that's giving it to me in bandwidth cost. So there's all these different financial models that are out there for very good reasons, by the way. It's not that there's a problem with that. But the inability for people to bring these down into a common financial metric and one that's meaningful is one of the things that's really slowing down the process and making it difficult for people to make these decisions. And then the third one is creating a structured approach for what we call these strategic factors. So the strategic factors, again, these are ones that are not necessarily financially related, but are really driving a lot of the decisions, and trying to get some structure around it so that meaningful conversations can happen. I sat in on one meeting, and the meeting went, I'm sure many people have been in these meetings, right? You're in there for 2 hours, and no really meaningful progress was made because there wasn't a common language. There wasn't a structured way to talk about the problems and the challenges and the issues they were facing. And so these were the 3 main areas that we started to focus on as we went through these discussions with the different customers. So from the financial metrics, again, here's some of the conclusions. I'm going to walk you through some of the details on this as well. So first thing was, how do I normalize costs? And we're picking a 10-year TCO. I saw Andy earlier had a 15-year, whatever time period you want to use is fine. But the key part is to do it on dollars per watt. All right, and Matt earlier showed that the cost to build a data center in millions of dollars per megawatt. That's the same metric. Okay, the thing that we have to get away from as an industry is talking about square feet. Right, square feet's an important metric that needs to be in there, but it's almost irrelevant to cost on a data center. Almost irrelevant. The cost is all driven by what is the power infrastructure, the cooling infrastructure, and so forth. The second point, which was very interesting, is utilizing the cumulative cash outlay to try and find a break-even point and start actually draw those curves of what does it look like. Many of the financial people, the CFOs, might be more interested in what is the cumulative cash outlay and when do I break even versus what's the actual 10-year TCO. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I'll also bring up the third point, which is insight into OpEx versus capital expenditures, because it's not an even-sum game. Certainly there's a desire in many companies to take capital and convert it into operating expense, and there's ways of doing that. But there's other companies where the capital isn't necessarily as sensitive, so we'll talk about that a little bit too. But those are the 3 big financial metrics that we started talking about. So I touched on this a little bit about this benefit of using very simple models to evaluate your options. And this is something that we are driving very hard on, is trying to simplify these decisions to get something down to where, again, if I'm just trying to make a comparison between 2 issues, between 2 decisions, generally you can do a simple model and you can get pretty close to giving you an idea of which one's better than the other. And again, that's separate and distinct from actually putting together the budget plan. The actual budget plan, again, you got to be more detailed. But if I'm just comparing 2, I can put together a relatively simple model and get very close and help me do it. So it gives you the possibility of easy-to-use tools. And this is something we really believe needs to happen in the industry, is simplifying these processes. The second part that it gives you, which is incredibly important in these conversations that companies are going through, is how do I put a structure to my decision making? What are the main decisions that I need to make? What are the things that I should focus on? The human brain cannot deal with somebody coming to you and saying, you've got to evaluate 250 options and 250 variables. Nobody can do it. All right? And particularly what I found is that as you talk higher in the organization, as you get up to the C-level suites, the actual capacity to deal with that level of detail becomes even more difficult. So you really need to get down to what are the 2 or 3 things that really drive that decision and make it simple. And the other quick one on this one, another point is the quick iterations to assist in planning. One of the things is, again, if you have this very complex model of 250 variables that I mentioned, and somebody comes in and they say, okay, well, what if I did this? What if and this is generally what happens in these meetings. Well, gee, what if we built a smaller data center? What if I went to tier 2? What if I decide to go to a different colo? Right? You get into all these what if scenarios. If every time you do that, you have to run out of the meeting, spend 2 weeks analyzing what that option was, and then come back, it takes an incredible amount of time to get through this planning process. And we had some customers who, because the planning process was so complex, they just gave up, and they just either said, well, forget it, we'll just do what we did before, or forget it, I'll just go and do a colo. But they kind of gave up through that process. So this need to be able to very quickly go through and play what if games. And particularly, again, even at the C level, they want to be able to see that I can quickly do those options. So that's something we found very important through this. And but there are drawbacks to this, so I want to be clear, this isn't, like I said, it's not something that you shouldn't be using as a real budgeting tool, but using these easy-to-use tools is not every situation matches the model. There's going to be exceptions, right? So you can find ones that will. And the results are as good as the data and the assumptions that you want to make. Okay, so the whole idea is that you can put in different assumptions, and depending on those assumptions, you get results. If you make a bad assumption, you're going to get what you want. So most of the time, simple models, though, they're going to get you close enough when you're trying to evaluate these types of decisions. Okay, so the first thing we did is we went through, and again, you can challenge the assumptions, but we've actually had this tool challenged by a number of different people. So we've taken our tool that we've developed, and we've had a number of co-location providers go through it and challenge it. We've had different analyst firms. I asked them to take a look and challenge it just to see, how robust it was and how to hold up. And at this point, we're pretty confident that these numbers are not completely out of line. But our 10-year TCO for co-location came down to $62 per watt for the data center. Okay, but here are the assumptions that we used. So we did a model where the rack costs $1,000 per month per rack. The colo provides the rack at no additional cost to the customer. So we just assumed you get the rack for free. Not all colos work this way, but in our model, that seemed to work pretty well. Power costs you $800 per month per rack. You can see the bandwidth costs. These are some key variables too. What's the rate increase that you assume? So in this model, to get to $62, the rate increase per year from the colo is assumed to be 5%. Right? We've had some people come back and say, geez, that's not the right one. It should be 3, it should be 6. But again, we picked 5 for this exercise. Remote hands fee of $225 per hour. And we just made an assumption that each rack takes an hour per month. People come back and challenge that and say, well, it really should be half that, or it should be something different. But either way, those are the numbers we gave. 4 kilowatts per rack and a 3% discount rate for the TCO calculation. So that's the cost of capital we used was 3%. Right? And I'll talk about that more in a second. But we, these were assumptions that we picked because this is what we viewed to be typical. Now, are they typical for everybody? No. But again, that's what the point is of the tools, that you can go in and challenge those. All right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the process here to show how, using these base assumptions, okay, the 10-year TCO for the colo doesn't change. It stays at $62 per watt. Okay? And we'll show you how it compares up against some other options that somebody might look at. So I'm sure all of you can read this, right, from the back? Is that? Okay. So I apologize for that. But this is actually a cut and paste from our white paper that we did with this. And it's basically giving that there's basically 3 basic strategies to an upgrade. So again, the analysis that we're doing is, what if I want to upgrade a data center that I've got? What if I want to build a new one? Or should I go out to a co-location provider? How do I compare those 3? All right? And that's a very typical thing. And so the first model is what I call consider the low-hanging fruit model. So this is, say I have a data center and it's just wasn't implemented very well. I know nobody in this room has a data center like that, right? Everyone here has got perfect data centers. I realize that, but the odd case you run into one that's not. But these are getting to things like, what if I have excess power and cooling? I heard a couple people laughing. So it's what if I have excess power and cooling capacity? Okay, but I'm just not being able to utilize it inside of the data center. So there's things like, go through, make sure you got all your blanking panels. Make sure you've got brush strips in place. Make sure that you're utilizing best practices as best you can within that existing data center. I'm not talking about adding any capacity. Just go through and clean it up. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is, what if I want to consider going to higher density? So this is basically, free up some space in the data center. What if I add some new high density zones? Those might implement in with, say, some UPSs in for those zones and with cooling equipment going into those zones. So we thought that would be an interesting model to look at. So this is one where, maybe someone went and did a virtualization project and they went from 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet. Now I got 5,000 square feet. I've still got switch gear and I got chiller capacity, but I'm out of UPS capacity, right? And I don't have any cracks to support it. What do I do? Right, so that's the model that in your head. And then the third one was even more disruptive into the current facility is, what if we want an added capacity? And we use an example of, prefabricated modules in this example, but it doesn't have to be. But this is this idea of, again, I've got space. I did the virtualization project, but now I don't have switch gear available. I don't have chiller available. I got to add capacity in order to support the new expansion that I want to do. So those are, consider adding to facility capacity. In all of the ones that we analyzed, everything that we looked at, almost every project of an upgrade fits into one of these three categories. We weren't able to find one that didn't. Okay, make sense? So again, we just modeled these out. This is actually, we didn't do a tool for this. This was one we just did by hand. But, so low-hanging fruit model, and the model we did, which again was based off some people that we saw, and we kind of did the cost analysis. So we made it generic and said tier 3, 1 megawatt design load, utilized a 900 kilowatt. So the D rating was because of air mixing, right? In this case, the example data center we're using just really had didn't have blanking panels in, didn't do the basics well. To go and fix that, we determined the 10-year TCO was $17 per watt. And the first cost to implement it was $2.10 per watt. Okay? So this is how you can start seeing how this common financial metric starts helping, right? I'm going through and I'm looking at what's my cost to implement all of the blanking panels, what's the cost to implement best practice inside of that data center, and then normalize it into how much did that cost me versus how many watts of capacity did I free up. So $2.10 in this case. And again, so you're looking at this and saying for somebody who's got this situation, it's going to cost you 10-year TCO $17 per watt versus $62, and my first cost is $2.10. That's a lot cheaper than going to a Colo. Okay, in all scenarios it was cheaper. And then if you look on the right, you can see you start taking your cash flow outlays and laying them into a curve, and you can start seeing where's your break even. It's not a true break even in a financial sense, but I think it it holds water for what we're trying to do here. So you'd see your break even is less than 1 year. Okay. All right, so now this was one example. This is not meant to say that every single data center that gets blanking panels and brush strips is going to fit into this. It's meant to show you, though, that how quickly you can get to $2.10 per watt. It's a lot cheaper than the Colo model in this example. The second one is what if I implemented higher density? So again, this is this example where I put in a pod. I add in a 40 kilowatt zone is the model that we use, 4 kilowatts per rack. We included 2N UPS, 2N in-row cooling. We assumed a PUE of 1.35. I'm sure there's people in the audience who would say there's no way you can do that at 1.35. We actually think if you did it right, that's a pretty reasonable assumption. But either way, so your 10-year TCO here is $22 per watt. And so your first cost to upgrade is $4.80 per watt in this scenario. So again, now you can start seeing how you can compare it. But look what happens to my cash outlay. So my break even now is less than 2 years. Okay, but it's slid out from just being a couple of months out to almost a year. And then the third scenario for upgrading is what if I want to add the facility capacity? So again, this is this idea. In this case, it was a pretty big add because these were the model we had was where we had we had a high degree of confidence in terms of our cost assumptions. But what if I wanted to add in 500 kilowatts of capacity, for example? PUE of 1.35 again. You go through, you do this model, and you can see 10-year TCO now is $27 per watt. And the first cost to upgrade is $8.45. So again, that's comparing against the Colo as 62, and the break even is in about 2 years. Okay. Now what's fascinating about this is, and I'll tell you internally when we released this tool, there was a large amount of consternation that came back from various parts of our company, okay, asking about this question. And what was fascinating was everyone was focusing on the 10-year TCO cost, okay. I can tell you the more interesting conversation with customers that we're having is around the break-even point. It's really about the cash. When I go into the customers that we were talking going through this, given the environment, given the economic environment that we're in, the focus on cash is much greater than the focus on 10-year TCO. So I think that's been an interesting shift. I mean, 10 years ago, that's all we were talking about as a company, APC or Schneider, was, hey, go look at 10-year TCO. But what I'm finding right now is that customers are much more heavily looking at short-term financial cash conditions. And I think that's still something coming from the the recession and what have you. So the fourth scenario, now this is where we actually do have the trade-off tool available. So this is the key assumption we said is 1 megawatt capacity. So again, this is in the Matt's numbers earlier, but pretty much we think you should be able to build a tier 3 1 megawatt data center for about $12 per watt. I know some people have higher numbers than that, some people have lower, but that seemed like a good basic assumption. 4 kilowatts per rack. In this case, we have a lease assumption of $5 per square foot per month. Right? We did build in a battery refresh, so we counted for what's the ongoing operating costs, the people and what have you. PUE of 1.35, roughly 1.33 in this model. Again, OpEx increases of 3% per year on the build. And we did build in a bandwidth cost. So the 10-year TCO on this one came out to $42 per watt. Right? So $12 per watt up front, $42 10-year TCO, compared it against a Colo of $62 per watt. And the break even, if you look at those two curves, if you map it out, gets you to 3.5 years. Okay? So the main thing I want to get you to take away from this is, by using these common financial metrics, you can see I can take those 4 different options and compare against going to a Colo, and you can pretty easily start having a rational conversation. All right? The other point that's interesting too, and again, I'll just reiterate what I said before, is the 10-year TCO number. When you came out with this, everyone focuses on the 10-year TCO number. That's typically what happens. When I talk to people on the facility side, when I say everyone, people on the facility side, people that are building the data center, there's a heavy focus on cost. Okay? Most of the time, when you take that plan and you go to the financial guys are focused on cash. Those are the two big difference in curves. And I'll tell you something, a 3.5-year payback, makes this kind of a toss-up, in my opinion. Okay, so we got done with this analysis, and I actually, 3.5 years, if you go to a typical financial guy and you tell him 3.5 years, he might be inclined to try and go, even if the 10-year TCO is higher, he's going to be inclined to moving more towards a Colo model in this example. So I think that was a big takeaway that we had is through this process, is cost versus cash is a critical piece of it. The other thing that we learned, and this is where we got challenged quite a bit, was on what should we use as the cost of capital? And particularly when you're talking about TCO, the model is highly sensitive to cost of capital on the TCO basis. So this is an important thing that you need to play around with. When you're doing these models and when you're looking at these evaluations, is focus on the assumptions which are highly sensitive. What are the ones where if I make a small change, that small change really has a big impact? And cost of capital is actually one of them. So if you take our cost of capital, I think we used 3%, and if you do 8%, you can see what the difference is. So in the first scenario, we said the Colo is $62 per watt, the build was $42, so that's a $20 per watt difference, right, on the TCO. If I go to 8% cost of capital, that difference shrinks to $13 per watt. Okay, it doesn't change your break even, by the way, because the break even is all just on cash, how much cash is going out the door, but it does change your TCO analysis. Okay, so what's fascinating about this is, what you pick as your cost of capital, which has a big impact on your TCO, is highly variable by the company and what they like to look at, right? So I've seen companies where they like to use 3%. I've talked to other companies that are 8%. There's other companies where, in order to go and get money, it's going to cost them more than 8%. It might cost them 12%. So what number you use has a big impact on what your TCO is going to be, which is one of the reasons I think it's a very critical thing to make sure that you're understanding what your assumption is going to be. But basically, as cost capital increases, co-location becomes more attractive. So then we thought it'd be fun. We drew this curve saying, hey, where does it actually, the TCOs equalize? And it turned out it looks like it's about 26%. So at 26% cost of capital, your TCOs are the same. Okay, we just thought that was an interesting slide to put together. Okay. So that's the big financial analysis, and some of the things we're trying to do to try and simplify it and get people to talk in ways that they can go through this. But again, I'll tell you, in most of the analysis that we did, it had nothing to do with the money. It really, the decisions, most of them had nothing to do with the money. And I'll tell you, a lot of our environment is, a lot of this analysis is probably a little more heavily biased towards smaller customers, smaller data centers, simply because we had access to a lot more of them, okay? And so that's one piece I'd put out. But in these, we identified 10 strategic factors, okay? It may not be your 10. If you're gonna go through and look at it, it doesn't really matter what the strategic factors are you pick. These have held up pretty well as we've gone through and talked to people. But I'll tell you one thing, if you go sit down and have a conversation and you have 50 strategic factors you're trying to consider, forget it, okay? You should probably get to around 10, even better, maybe there's 5 to 7 that you're looking at. And this is one thing that we're urging customers to do is just focus on the ones so you can actually get your brain around what you're talking about. okay? So we propose these 10. Again, the actual specifics aren't critical, but number one, company culture. There was one customer I met with, no matter what, you were not going to get those servers out of that guy's property, okay? He's in there going, look, no matter what, I want to be able to walk in that room. I don't know what he wanted to do with them, but he wanted to be able to walk in the room and see these things, right? And know that he had them. I want to know my stuff, right? I want to know where my stuff is. Another one that really came out is comfort with the IT equipment in a shared space. Okay, so this was really all of a sudden when I start evaluating, do I go to a co-location provider? I'm probably going to go look at 2 or 3 of them. How do I start evaluating whether one has better security than another, for example? People really got caught up on this. Like they don't know how to evaluate. Is this guy better than the next guy? And how does that compare to where I am right now? Okay, that was an example of an area of concern. Another one is that came out is you're telling me I'm going to put my stuff into a colo, but there's going to be some guy next to it. I don't have any control over the guy next to me. I'm dependent on the colo provider doing a good job. But how do I know that's going to happen? How do I manage that risk? What if the guy's hot air is blown directly into my stuff? Okay, now people might be looking at this saying it's not a rational concern, but these are concerns that came out. What about IT accessibility to the data center? So I'll go back to my guy that said, I want to be able to get in a room and see my stuff. Right, the close cousin to this guy was somebody who said, I don't care where they put the data center. I'm wide open on Colo, but I'll guarantee you, if there's a problem, I want my guys there in 15 minutes. Okay? 15 minutes was this was the CEO. He said, I want my guys there in 15 minutes. I want to hold them accountable. I don't want them telling me it's some other company's fault. Right? So 15 minutes, how many colos do you think he had within 15 minutes of his facility? I think he had researched this. I think he actually just didn't want them to go to a co-location. And the guy had looked at it and found out that there was one, right? So he figured that eliminated the realm of possibility, perhaps. But that was certainly something that was there is, I want my guys there. I'm paying my guys to make sure this stuff's running. You're not going to tell me that it's some third party that caused a problem. Then you also have the opposite, by the way. We had other guys that we talked to, and they sat there and said, look, I know my guys, but you know what? I trust the Colo more, because the Colo, they've been doing this, and they're professionals, and I think they actually can do a better job. So that cuts both ways, okay, is how important is it that, the continuum of the scale of the IT accessibility data center. The other one is, what about comfort with dependence on contract terms? I talked to one guy, and it's interesting to me, because my experience with this thing is, when I first heard about cloud, and in this case, cloud, say email, right, going to, some cloud provider for email, I would have thought that like a mid-sized companies would have been the first ones to go. My experience is that those guys are actually the last ones to go, right? And this is a specific example on email, and it's because I talked to a few of these guys, and they said, look, email's pretty critical to us, right? That's, we use email, it kind of keeps things up and running, that's how I communicate with a lot of people. And if the email system goes down, I'm in big trouble, right? Just by the nature of this guy's business, I'm in big trouble. So what he said is, if I call up one of these big cloud providers, and I'm, a medium-sized company, the chance that I'm going to get them to respond to me is practically zero. So I'm just going to hang on to it until I got a comfort with that. So in other words, if I call, is anybody actually going to answer? If my stuff is in the Colo, right, and there's a problem, are you really going to pay attention to me? And then more importantly, I've got a contract with you that you're going to give me a certain SLA, but what if you don't meet your SLA, right? Then what do? You've got my stuff. What am I going to do, sue the guy that's got my stuff? Right? Probably not. Okay, so these are all concerns that came up that we called the soft issues. And again, there's other people that are sitting there saying, I'm totally comfortable with this. I got a contract, they're professionals, they're going to run it, no problem, right? But depending where you are on that spectrum, it really changes the conversation. I kind of mentioned this one. So these are a little bit more quantitative, but what about the critical facilities expertise? I'm going to go build a data center. Look, I haven't built a data center. I don't know anything about building data centers. The guys on my IT staff have never built a data center. Why would I do it, right? Too big a risk. I'm going to go to a Colo. What about regulatory compliance? HIPAA, for example, right? So if you're a healthcare, this was one that came out pretty strongly. The healthcare people, they got all these regulations they're trying to comply with. If I go to a Colo provider that can't comply with those regulations, I'm out of luck. So I have to go build a data center in that case. It's not even an option in that example. Life expectancy, what if I only need this data center for a few months, right? This is where the cloud computing model becomes really compelling. Forget about a 10-year TCO. If I'm only going to be there for 2 or 3 years and then I'm moving on to something else, that's going to win every time. And what's your deployment time frame? We talked about, everyone wants to get modular data centers, and the promise of modular data centers is speeding up the speed of deployment. But I'll tell you, there's nothing faster than if there's a Colo with open space and I just roll my stuff in and I'm up and running. Okay? You're not going to get faster than that. So that makes the decision really easy. Financial model preferences is the third category. So again, these are the 10 that we picked. But what's your perceived size of the capital investment? So we talk about the cost of capital and do people want to invest. The perceived size of the capital investment is important. So the example I use here is I met with a company, it was a tugboat company. It is a tugboat company. Their capital budget, they build 3 tugboats a year. Their capital budget for tugboats, I think, is about $24 million a year as a result. They build 3 a year. So you're talking to a guy who's going out and getting $24 million of capital every year to go build these tugboats. When you go to him and talk, he had like a 100 kilowatt data center or a 60 kilowatt data center. You go and talk to that guy about spending money on his data center, and you're talking about, on a relative capital budget, peanuts. Okay, so it's still real money, and obviously he looks at it, but he didn't perceive $200,000 to be a lot in his example. But if you go and talk to a couple of guys that are doing a startup, $200,000 is an insurmountable amount of money, perhaps. If you're working at a company that might be interested in doing an acquisition, is trying to hoard up as much cash as possible so they can go do the acquisition, that $200,000 is going to be heavily scrutinized. Okay? So this perception of what's the size of the capital investment changes over time, too, even within the same company. If there's a cash-tight year, then you view it one way. If cash is a little bit more available, it views another way. So there's another one important. And then your cash flow model preference, obviously, if you build, you got the big capital outlay versus going more incrementally. Okay, so then you put together these little scorecard. You put them on there, and in this case, we're saying, score them 1 to 10. Maybe you can add it up. You can maybe do a weighted one if you want, right? But either way, the important part is, even if it's not these 10, get to some number that you can actually put them on a list and start evaluating what are our softer issues that we're trying to deal with. So again, I mentioned we got a new TradeOff tool to help with this. And the summary here is, use the model to evaluate the financial options with a common language. I think I covered that pretty well. Cultural issues sometimes can dominate the conversation. Don't neglect those. And the trick here is create an objective way to discuss them. And then again, I'm a big believer in using these tools to help facilitate the conversation, allow for a rapid evaluation of your options. Okay, so that's basically the white paper and the TradeOff tool. All right. So, but through this process, we learned a bunch of other things, and I just wanted to share some of those because it kind of gives you, so this is a little bit more of, this isn't a published white paper or anything, but this is a little bit more of coming out of this, things that Kevin found interesting that I wanted to talk about, okay? So market forces that might change the game. So I think Andy already hit on this first one, is application layer resiliency will drive down the cost of data center physical infrastructure. I actually don't think this one's that far out. I think this is happening now. So this idea that I can have, I'll talk about it in a little bit. Co-location provider actions, this is going to be, this is an interesting dynamic, is that some of the things I see happening with the co-location providers is actually going to drive down the cost to build an enterprise data center. And then I also believe that the modular builds, a lot of this is going to be driven out of the Colo market, and that's actually going to close this cash gap. So we talked about how much capital do I need to put out before I can start using my data center. That's going to, compared to doing a co-location model, I actually think that's going to help close that a little bit. So again, so applications now are alive, they can move around. So here's one example of how you can start doing that. I think everybody in the room has heard about this, so I won't belabor the point. This was supposed to be a fantastic slide showing the servers moving, the applications moving from one server to another, but we had some problems there getting the slides together. But the point here is that the software resilience is going to minimize the need for the complex physical infrastructure. Instead of putting all tier 4 data centers in, I think you're going to start seeing multiple lower tier data centers. And I think this is, again, something Andy identified as well. And my question that really comes up, and this is, this came out very strongly in the conversations we had as we were researching the papers. Hey, what's more reliable? What if I did 2 tier 1 or 2 tier 2 data centers or 1 tier 4? Which one's more reliable? Okay, what's more reliable, a tier 4 or a tier 3? And there's a lot of confusion in the market over this. I mean, maybe not for the people in this room, but when we start talking to people, and you guys talk about, this is an interesting feedback for Uptime maybe, is you start talking about tier certification, tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, and getting real data on what is the actual experience in terms of that reliability and what's the cost premium to get it. Our experience was when you're getting into like the C-level suite, they had a hard time understanding these things, okay? And so the example I say is, I always like having little graphics, but I found this one interesting, is, tier 4 is basically I'm putting all my eggs in one basket, but with virtualization and cloud computing and the ability to, have the services move between data centers, are we moving more towards the things of, what it says here is, how many times have I told you not to put all the children in the same basket, right? So, maybe I'm better spreading my eggs around so I have multiple data centers. So I think this is real and this is happening. This is not something that I think is far out. People are looking at, maybe some lower, it's not happening on every application, but I'm starting to see through this exercise that there's an awful lot of look at which IT applications, if we start virtualizing them, which ones would be the first ones that we'd start experimenting with on this. Okay, so that's something I think is happening. So this one's again going to be a little bit of an eye chart, but this is what I call the virtuous cycle of reference design. So I think some other people call them open designs, but this idea that there's published out into the public a design of a data center that I can go and implement. And I think what's driving this is one of the things we started picking up is a typical enterprise data center, let's say it costs $18 per watt. I know I said 12 in the earlier slide, some people say 18, whatever it might be. This is just meant to illustrate a point. And you can go to conferences like this, and I've been in meetings, I've seen co-location providers claim they can build a data center for $8 per watt, and nobody else can touch that, so that's one of the reasons that colos are going to win in the long run, right? Then what happens is you go back, so people go to these little conferences, they come back and they look at it and they have these strategic factors, remember the 10 strategic factors I talked about, and the enterprise decides that they want to keep that data center or a few of their applications in-house, right? So now they're looking at it and they're getting confused. They're saying, well, I just went to a conference, a guy said $8 per watt, and I know last time we spent $18 per watt. Why do we have this big gap, right? So I'll tell you what, next time, why don't you go just build me one of those, right? Whatever this guy built for $8 per watt, just go build me one of those. Don't give me any of these other designs. Just show me one of those designs, and maybe we can't get to 8, but maybe we can get to 10, okay? And this is real, this is starting to happen. So the enterprise requests a reference design of a cheaper build, and what's happening to companies like us is I've got customers coming to us and saying, can you just show me what these guys are doing and how they're doing it at $10 per watt, or give me an example of how you would do it that would get you close? I went through a look at your TradeOff tool, right? So this is starting to happen in the market, but it's not just us feeling this, okay? You're seeing many other companies do it, and I think I got a slide here. So here are the examples of OpenCompute. To me is an example of a reference design, and this was mentioned earlier in one of the earlier sessions. This is why they're interested in doing it, because customers are looking and saying, well, if I got to go build a data center and it's going to perform like Facebook, maybe I can just build the Facebook data center, right? And they take those ideas and they work from there. So going back to it is why reference designs. This is what we're starting to see happen is allow customers to evaluate the trade-offs and simplifies the planning stage. So this thing of, hey, if I want to build a tier 4, what does that look like? What's a tier 3 look like? What's a tier 2 look like? Okay, give me an idea of what the cost is, how long to build, how complex, right? So reduces cycle time to create the data center as a result. The perception that you're working from proven designs that are more predictable. Describes capabilities and costs with technical detail. So this is always nice, I can actually get a reference designs and I got some level of technical detail as opposed to just like, stick drawings on a piece of paper, right? And I can get it very quickly and easily. We think it's also a great way to enable sharing of best practices with the industry. And ultimately, this is something else that started coming out is simplifies training. So your project teams start becoming more efficient, right? Because you're already working from somebody else's base idea. It gives you something to start from and work. So it's not the first time that you're doing it in effect. You can stand on the shoulders of others. So this whole cloud, Colo, it's reinforcing reference designs and standardization. So the market, we believe, is moving towards lower cost, more modularity and portability, improved scalability and capacity, greater application flexibility and portability. So, we've been beating this drum as a company about, the need to standardize, to achieve those goals. The best way to get there is through standardization, but the best way to improve what's happening is through open designs. So it's not that there's going to be one standard and that's perfect and we're done. It's going to be that there's going to be elements of standardization that start coming in to address these needs, but the fact that the designs are going to be more open than what you've seen in the past is going to introduce another dynamic. And we talk about prefab modular builds, and again, I think, we've got a terminology challenge inside of the industry, but, I think we got to start thinking in terms of partial prefabricated builds. You've got a lot of customers that we're seeing and some of the leaders in the industry are building a significant percentage of data centers with prefabricated power skids, okay? So is that a prefabricated data center? Is that a prefabricated build? I don't know. But there's an example of one that could be an interesting one is, you could have skid or container-based power and cooling on the outside of the building. Maybe you just build like a cheap warehouse. This is just meant to illustrate the point. And then I build out kind of a fairly traditional white space inside using this kind of pod concept of IT equipment. And in this example, he said, well, they're hot air contained, no raised floor required. building shell, scale out incrementally. This could be a very viable model in the future about how you're building data centers, as opposed to just the vision of everything being in containers, right? I think we got to broaden our definition over what we mean, because there's going to be, depending on the site, there's portions of prefabrication that make sense, and there's portions that won't make sense. But the point here is that there's a virtuous cycle starting to happen here, and I think right now we still, even though we've been talking about modular data center builds for a long time in this industry, I still believe we're very early in the cycle on this thing, and that there's a pump priming that's just starting to occur right now. So, if you talk to a lot of the colos, they'll talk about their speed to revenue, so very focused on cash. I don't want to deploy my power and cooling equipment until I know I can start getting revenue for that. And again, they try to balance that with the long-term cost. But what we're seeing right now is that it's a lot of the co-location providers are driving a lot of activity. Not the only activity, but they're driving a lot of activity, and it's this focus on cash efficiency is driving the colos to prefab builds. What's going to start happening is that's going to start driving volume in the industry. Okay, this is already happening, and what's happening is as the volume goes up, then it starts becoming easier for companies like us to make these things readily available, right? Not just us, I mean, there's other companies in this thing, but when the volume starts coming in, all of a sudden they can start becoming more readily available. And I know you can't read this in the back, but then the third one says proven implementations. This is another one, is, show me data centers that are actually built this way. So as the colos are driving it because of cash, they're going to start seeing module availability will go up. You'll see proven designs. That then makes this more viable for a true enterprise data center. It starts becoming more interesting at that point. So enterprises will recognize better cash and energy efficiency than typical builds. Okay, I think the big part is the cash efficiency. So if all of a sudden I can start deploying in modular ways, and I know I can get the it's not there today, but this promise of an 8 to 10 week delivery time, it's all about how do I minimize my cash. How do I maximize my cash productivity? So even if I'm an enterprise, I want to go and deploy a data center. If I can deploy it in chunks and I know I can get them in 8 to 10 weeks, I might sacrifice a little bit of TCO, but I know I'm going to get more predictable builds. I'll probably get better energy efficiency because it's more predictable, and utilize my cash more efficient. So the cash model of the enterprise data center starts becoming more competitive with the co-location model. Okay. And then prefab approach driven by colos are actually going to benefit in-house builds. So there's a little bit of my prediction of what's happening right now in the marketplace. So much of this activity, because of this trend on colos, and the trend of people looking at colos and the compelling, I mean, candidly, when you go through that analysis that I did and you look at the cash, it is incredibly compelling in many cases to go into a co-location provider. But what's interesting is as the colos are driving growth and driving builds, I think that's going to overflow into benefiting the enterprise side as well. So again, summary, software resiliency will start replacing power and cooling resiliency. I think it's likely you're going to see tier levels go down, okay, over time. I'm not predicting when, by the way. This is, when is really tough on these things. But I think it'll happen over time. I don't think it's going to be a tsunami where one day all of a sudden everyone starts throwing out their tier 4 data centers and going to tier 2. But I do think if you look forward 15 years from now, you're going to see a lot more lower tier data centers than the higher tier data centers versus where we are today. And the colo and cloud trend is actually driving more open designs and standards, and they're driving lower cost of builds in general for the industry. So to me, this is just a great free market story of the colos being entrepreneurial and driving a lot of great things in the industry are really going to benefit everybody else as well. Okay, and I think that's it. So there's the white paper. It's white paper 171. I usually can't remember the numbers, so they always put them on the slides for me. And then we do have this TCO calculator. I'd love for you guys to take a look at it, challenge it, come back and talk to us, because it's something that, again, we're just interested in getting feedback on at this point. So at that point, any questions? I can't really see, so. Somebody down here.
I'm really intrigued by the idea of tiering your data centers based on what's sitting in there from an application standpoint.
Right.
Do you have any trends that you're seeing with larger companies trying to go back to their IT groups and talking about being willing to tier their applications? So I think about, I'll use an example like retailers. We wouldn't want to put things like our ordering system or our merchandising system just anywhere, but maybe there's lower tier applications we would. Have you heard of anybody that's developing a model for how you would do that?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So, and the answer to that question is absolutely. So what is clearly happening, so I talk about the reduction in tier levels. The way it's going to happen is by the facilities people talking to the IT people about that very topic of what stuff really needs to be in a high availability zone and which stuff can be in a low availability zone. And the first model that this is going to be is it's all going to be within one data center, but I'm going to build out this part of the data center as tier 3, tier 4, and I might build out this part of the data center as tier 2. I'm going to run the lower critical applications in the tier 2 part, and I'll run the really mission critical ones in the tier 4. So those are the types of conversations that we're seeing. That's kind of the first model. So as opposed to an idea of two different data centers, one's at tier 2, one's at tier 3, it's actually happening within the same data center, which is what's driving, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be prefabricated, but it's certainly driving more modular concepts, because then I can see that I can run 2N power and 2N UPS over to one section, but the other part of the data center, maybe I don't make that investment in the power and cooling infrastructure. So if I had to guess, those are the types of conversations we're seeing. And it is, you're bringing up an excellent point that I meant to emphasize, which is the need for facilities and IT to be working together and putting together a strategy around this is just becoming more critical. I mean, we've talked about this a lot as an industry, but it's just, you can't go to virtualization and take advantage of some of these things without getting the organizations really planning well together. So, does that answer your question? Oh, looking for a model. That's a great idea. Where are here's my data center folks here. So we'll, we don't have one today, but we could probably help build one. So, any other questions?
Chris Johnston with Siska Hennessy Group. Did I understand you to say that you feel that prefab is more energy efficient?
Yeah. So go ahead. Are you done?
What, I might have a follow-on depending on what you say.
Okay. I'm sure you will, Chris. So the answer, thank you for asking that, because the answer to that question is no. There's nothing inherent in doing a prefabricated approach that makes it more energy efficient. I mean, I can do a stick-built design versus a prefab design, and I can get to the same levels of efficiency. What I do think, though, is that the prefab has an advantage in terms of the predictability of the builds. So the chances that when you go and install it that you get all the controls right, I mean, theoretically, if you do that all in a factory, when you go to deploy it, the chances that it's actually done the way that you intended is much better. So it should simplify commissioning and give you and raise your chances that you get the chances that your design gets implemented and built as designed go way up in a prefabricated build.
Okay, good. I agree with you on that.
Whew,
I would make one comment about OpenCompute.org.
Yeah.
Is that if you go back and look at, particularly on the cooling side, of what they do, it doesn't exactly fit so well inside the ASHRAE TC 9.9 thermal model. So what anybody should do in this situation is look at any standards or OpenCompute or whatever, reference standards, assumptions, and look at their business model and see if their business model and my business model or your business model are the same.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because you can get yourself in a lot of trouble with these reference designs if you're not careful, right? And you're bringing up an excellent point. I didn't really cover it, but you see these things come out, and you see, the example I use of a customer saying, well, just go build me one of those. Well, the reality is, you may not be able to build one of those, right? You might not have the site for it. You know better than anyone else, right? The level of complexity, but it's easy for the C-level guys to sit there and say, just go build one. What's the big deal? It's a data center. I've been in these meetings, right? And then when you start trying to explain all the complexity, it starts becoming hard. But if we had in the future, think about this, the industry, and I think OpenCompute is a good example that's driving it, is you had a big library of reference designs. Then I can sit with the CEO and I can say, look, I can't build that data center because there's technical challenges. And if you want to hear all the technical challenges, I could bore you with it, right? But the reality is, here's another design that this guy built that's pretty close to what we need to do, and here's what it looks like, okay? So I think that's an excellent point. And that's actually one of the things that, as I talk about this, you have to be careful, because it's not that there's one reference design, it's that there's going to be a library of reference designs. But I think what's going to happen is they're going to get much more public, and conversations like this over how do I improve them is going to become much more transparent than maybe where it's been in the past. Does that make sense? So, okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Hope you found it interesting.